Hello, I'd like to talk about some of my favorite books from 2025, and I've kind of broken it up into a few different categories. As far as like the most riveting books, the ones that were most directly enjoyable and entertaining and interesting, one of the big ones was Chess. This is a really short novella. I'd recommend this to most people, and it stands out to me as kind of giving this sense of excitement about what was going to happen next and where the story was going to. And yeah, this really was a delight to read. It is kind of a darker book, so maybe delight is the wrong word, but it's extremely interesting, extremely readable. So that's Chess, Stefan Zweig. One of the most wonderful discoveries for me of 2025 is Émile Zola and this book, Thérèse Raquin, which is kind of like a mixture of genres. It sort of feels like a gothic horror at times, or a psychological horror. But it's for me, it was extremely unique. It digs into these characters' minds and kind of like flows through this very complicated interpersonal nightmare situation. And yeah, it has some elements you could say sort of like a mystery or a suspense thriller kind of, but it's pretty depraved, and I've never really read anything like this before, and can't wait to read more Zola. I don't hear enough people talking about this on YouTube, but I really recommend checking it out, especially if you like books from this era. But I haven't read a lot of stuff from the 1800s, and the stuff that I have read is not really my favorite stuff so far. But this one really blew me away, so strongly recommend Thérèse Raquin. In the realm of like horror, science fiction, and also kind of adventure, maybe even fantasy, it's kind of hard to classify this book, but The Other Side of the Mountain by Michel Bernanos, this was a real gem. I'd heard about this from a few different places. Maybe most notably, it pops up in Jeff Vandermeer's anthology of weird fiction. It's actually a newer translation in that book, but this is kind of the original edition, which is what I read. And this is kind of amazing from start to finish. It's really enjoyable. It's not a masterpiece. It's not a 10 out of 10, but it's just a consistently interesting, enjoyable read with a lot of really strange stuff that happens. And something really timeless about this. So definitely would recommend checking this out, especially if you're into this approximate genre. If you like stuff like H.P. Lovecraft, you're probably going to like this. And maybe the most riveting book, but also having a lot of other qualities, is Shoot the Piano Player, which was originally known as Down There, but it was adapted into a film called Shoot the Piano Player, and it seems as though it just gets published under that name. So this is in the kind of noir, hard-boiled crime genre, and I did read a lot of stuff in this genre throughout 2025, but this stood out to me as the best out of all of the ones that I read. I read some Jim Thompson, some Raymond Chandler, a bunch of stuff I didn't like, such as Cornell Woolrich and John D. MacDonald, if that counts, and a whole bunch of other things. But to me, this is just head and shoulders above everything that I read, including Raymond Chandler, that's generally considered one of the masters. I got really excited about this author after reading this and have obtained multiple David Goodis books that I'm very much looking forward to reading eventually. But if you like the idea of seedy, mid-century noir crime fiction, really recommend checking this out. And I would also say if you like Sin City, particularly the comics, but even if you just like the movie, I think Sin City was heavily influenced by this book in particular. That's kind of what it reminded me of a little bit. So yeah, Shoot the Piano Player. Big recommendation from me. One of my favorite books of 2025. Let's talk about fantasy. I read a few fantasy books and didn't really like any of them. I tried to read I think it was called The Goblin Princess by George MacDonald, and did not really enjoy that at all. I read The Beginning Place by Ursula K. Le Guin and found that to be fairly mediocre. But this is a book from around the year 1100, and there's a bunch of different translations of this. I've got the Burton Raffel translation here. I've got a few of them, but I landed on this one as my preferred translation after reading through a few different options. And this is a lesser known character from kind of the Arthurian legends. Yvain, he's like the knight of the lion, which means he, not just that he has like a lion on his shield, but he actually has a lion as his companion. And despite this being one of the oldest existing Arthurian stories, to me it feels very modern, which has a lot to do with the translation, but I found this very enjoyable considering how old it is. I've tried to read some semi-ancient things and didn't really connect with them, but this was kind of a delight for me from start to finish. I don't read a lot of fantasy, but there's a lot of great stuff in here, and I don't think this is very well known. I haven't really heard anybody else talk about this book, so maybe check it out if you like the sound of it. So let's talk about like psychological books. I'm not going to say too much about this, but maybe my favorite book of the year in general was Notes from Underground by Dostoevsky, and I had a great time reading this. It's so intense and psychologically interesting, especially in the second half. So yeah, I love this book. Yeah, and I do recommend perhaps reading this out loud. I think this is a book that is more enjoyable if you actually read it out loud, especially the first half of it, which kind of is more like a furious monologue. I actually read it out loud for various reasons and just really had fun kind of embodying this character and going on this wild rant. So, if, just to give you a little taste of that, you can be like, let's see, you could be like, you have to kind of get into the vibe of it. You'd be like, but it is precisely in this cold, loathsome half-despair, half-belief, in this conscious burying oneself alive from grief for 40 years, in the underground, in this assiduously produced and yet somewhat dubious hopelessness of one's position, in all this poison of unsatisfied desires penetrating inward, in all this fever of hesitations, of decisions taken forever, and repentances coming again a moment later, that the very sap of that strange pleasure I was talking about consists. You know what I mean? It kind of if you like get into this character, it's really fun to read. But yeah, I did like the second half even more because it gets more into the story. The first half is kind of just this rant, sort of the philosophy of a scoundrel, but really interesting. It was my first time reading Dostoevsky, and I loved it. But a much lesser known psychological treat is this, Mary Westmacott, Absent in Spring. So this is actually the pseudonym of Agatha Christie, and I read an Agatha Christie book out of curiosity after reading this, a more standard Agatha Christie book called Crooked House, and I didn't like it at all. But this was where she kind of strayed from her usual formula. She did a few books under this pseudonym, and I came across this kind of by accident. I don't want to say much about it. I think it's best experienced with really no foreknowledge of what's going to happen. But this is really an underappreciated book, one of my favorite reads of the year. And if you like psychological novels, you got to check this out. I don't know how easy it is to get this book these days. I think it might be slightly uncommon. Maybe not. But yeah, this is a special book and a very unique, memorable, wonderful, but kind of fucked up reading experience. So, Absent in Spring, check it out. Okay, and then a couple books that were sort of, I would say, the most emotional books of the year for me. This one here, a fairly new book, Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan. Very short book. It's kind of a Christmassy book, so maybe save it for next year. But this is just great. I don't want to say too much about it, but there is a whole roller coaster ride of emotion packed into this very short book. So strongly recommend checking this out as well. In November, I decided to read a bunch of books taking place around World War II, and I think this was my most memorable out of all those, and definitely one of the more emotional reading experiences of the year for me. So this is Night by Elie Wiesel, and this is a newer translation. There's kind of an older translation you can also get. I had both copies and kind of compared the translations, and this one is perhaps objectively better. I don't know if that's fair to say, but it certainly seemed that way to me. And Yeah, this is one of the saddest books I've ever read. And if you like a sad book, if you're willing to engage with a story set in a concentration camp, this is a pretty excellent book. It's not a fun read, but it's a very powerful one, in my opinion. Okay, so then I've got two books that are kind of notable to me as being experimental books that I really enjoyed quite a bit. First one is The 10th of December by George Saunders. It's a collection of short stories, and they are very strange. He's got a completely unique style that would be hard for me to describe, but it's something about writing the way people think, I suppose, but in a very distinct way that sort of breaks the rules of how other writers generally operate. And it's kind of funny at times. At times it's science fiction-y, sort of Black Mirror-esque, and just one of the most original and exciting things I read all year. So I really strongly recommend this, and I can't wait to read more George Saunders. So yeah, check this out, 10th of December. Also experimental, but in a much different way. I read In the Heart of the Country by William H. Gass, and I mostly recommend the first story, The Pedersen Kid. It's kind of in the realm of William Faulkner, perhaps you could say, and I don't want to say much about it, and I do think you kind of have to be interested in something that is on the experimental side, but I really enjoyed reading this, and I think that the experience kind of expanded my horizons a little bit and opened my mind a bit to some of the different things that can potentially happen in a story if the author is willing to kind of mess around with the conventions of normal storytelling. I found the other stories interesting as well, but I don't know that I would recommend them necessarily, and they didn't affect me nearly as much as The Pedersen Kid. Also, there's an introduction by William H. Gass in the NYRB edition, which I read, and that's super interesting as well, just kind of getting this insight into what went into the writing of this and what it meant to him and why he wrote it this way. But it also led me to pick this up, which I'm kind of in the middle of reading, Fiction and Figures, and this is sort of feels like an extension of his introduction to In the Heart of the Country. And I kind of jumped on this after getting so much out of reading that introduction. This is just like a collection of essays where, so far at least, he's talking about interesting ideas about what fiction is and what characters are and what is a sentence and what are words. That sounds interesting to you. Check it out. I haven't read the whole thing yet, but so far it's been great. All right, so I've only got a few more books. I just want to quickly mention my two biggest disappointments of the year. So I've been hearing a lot about William T. Vollmann and was really excited to read my first Vollmann, and I ended up picking The Ice Shirt. And yeah, this kind of felt like reading the dictionary or something. I just had a terrible time reading this. I'm going to read more Vollmann, and I'll try some other stuff, but this didn't work for me at all. I don't understand what there is to enjoy about this. This felt more like kind of just a nonfiction book about history and mythology, and it didn't really connect with me at all. Also, I read my first Clarice Lispector, The Passion of G.H., and I was similarly really excited about this. This was experimental, some would say in the realm of William H. Gass, but in this case, it just felt random or something. I didn't really get anything out of it. It almost just felt like I was listening to someone with a severe mental illness talking to themselves. And yeah, I was not quite able to connect with whatever was happening in this book. I've heard some people say they love this. I haven't really understood their reasoning, but maybe it's more of just a feeling thing. And for me, I felt pretty bored and disconnected and just didn't enjoy this at all and wouldn't recommend it. However, I have a certain respect for this. There's something I still sort of appreciate about this, and I do want to try reading more Clarice Lispector. I've got a few of her other books, and I'll be giving her a second maybe even third chance. But this particular book I found quite unpleasant and was glad when it was over. All right, and my final two books, which are maybe my two favorites of the year, these are sort of maybe in the category of just the best writing on all the different dimensions. So storytelling, the quality of the writing itself, the sense of beauty and awe that maybe is contained in the writing, and interesting plot, interesting characters, all the stuff that kind of makes, to me, a good, well-rounded novel. These two, I think, were the most memorable, and the books that made me more excited about reading than I had been before having read them. The first one is J.M. Coetzee with Waiting for the Barbarians, and this really deserves to be, I think, read more. I haven't noticed a whole lot of reviews on YouTube for this book, but it's a weird, dark, sort of slightly mythical feeling, kind of timeless story that involves war and power struggles and weird psychological stuff. And it's quite hard to describe, especially since I'm trying to avoid talking about the plot in any detail. But this is one of my favorite reads of the year, and it's definitely one of my favorite discoveries in terms of the author. It seems like there's a whole bunch of books by this guy that seem to be pretty well rated as far as Goodreads and other sources. And so I'm really excited to read more by J.M. Coetzee. And yeah, if you've never heard of this guy or never heard of this book, definitely recommend checking it out. It's quite short and it's fantastic. And this might be my favorite book of the year, although it's really hard to say. And I think one of the reasons I would consider it to be that is just how much I've thought about it since reading it and how excited I am to read more by this author. And if you take any recommendation from this video, let this be the one. So this is Rosamund Lehmann with The Echoing Grove. And I don't like to really talk about the plot of a book. I think it's better to just go into it knowing as little as possible. So I'll just say some basic things to hopefully give you an idea of whether or not this is something you might be into. So to me, this kind of feels like it's sort of in the realm of Virginia Woolf, except more modern, a little less experimental, and it involves complicated, messy relationships. It has a sort of wonderful structure as far as how the story unfolds through time. And the actual writing itself, the way that this author uses language is amazing to me. And yet, I don't think she's really very well known at all these days. After I read this, I looked her up on YouTube, and I think there's like 2 reviews, and they're not by very big channels. So I think there could be a resurgence in interest in Rosamund Lehmann. I'm not sure what might provoke that, but hopefully I'll be contributing in a very small way, because I really think this is a massively underappreciated novel and a huge hidden gem for people who like real complicated relationship stories, especially ones that are written beautifully. So check this out. Maybe check out her other books. I haven't yet, but I will. And that's about it for my 2025 recommendations. And thank you for watching.